excellent. If you
Look
can hang
forward to the
around
panel.
for yeah, excellent. Great. Now I'd like to introduce Kingsley Dixon and John Dixon, and I'm unsure which is talking first. So if we can bring them up, they're sharing a time slot. So it's going to be a challenge for them. It's and obviously Kingsley's coming in first. So
thank you.
Leaping into the decade of restoration, welcome Kingsley.
Thank you. And thank you, Teen, for the precision timekeeping, but we're good mates. So I expect you might allow a minute or two.
No, I won't, Kingsley.
Yeah, no, you won't. So John and I are sharing the platform. It might seem as though the Dixons are taking over restoration because there's also Peter Dixon, but I trust you will believe me when I say we're unrelated, at least for what we know. I'm speaking as the incoming chair of the Society for Ecological Restoration. I take over in July of the world body, which is the first foreign chair. John will be presenting as executive chair of Restore Australia, which many people have spoken about today. The decade is an interesting one because SER was not fundamentally embedded at the very outset of the whole process, but we're now one of just a few global partners. And that all came through the international standards for the practice of ecological restoration, the 2019 second edition, which has now had over 21,000 full downloads. It is in full open access as a publication of restoration ecology. And why did we get involved? Because ecosystem restoration needed to be defined. It needed to have standards. The scale of what's planned is large, 350 million hectares by 2030, 9 trillion in ecosystem services, and up to 26 gigatons of greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, and potentially a lot more. This is so important because land degradation continues to be an important and critical part of all the equation. But to quote E.O. Wilson, and this is in 1998 when he was talking about the conservation dilemmas that the planet was facing, but I think it now applies to the restoration agenda, and particularly for all of the groups that we've heard of in this session on the decade, is that we need to look at consilience among the groups, and it's consilience not only in the science, but consilience amongst the NGOs that we've seen. And only through that will we be able to, and I've taken the Schlick-Steiner comment from 2007, will we be able to achieve, I think, the restoration at the tempo that is now required to achieve those outcomes. Now, land degradation globally is a major issue. The heat map here is really a map of threatened species. And Bruce, if ever there was a place in the world, New Zealand glows green, regardless of what you might think. And essentially, New Zealand is a model of where the decade could go in even 5 years' time. Australia and our region, though, suffers very badly as degradation hotspots. Land degradation in 1992 was 15% of the land area, 5% of the global domestic product. It grew to 25% in 2011, and then by 2020, it was more than a third of the land area was in a degraded state. So the need is there, the will is there, and we now need to collect our wisdoms and our skills to move forward. I showed you this at the keynote on Wednesday. At stake is 145 trillion of ecosystem services. It's important to understand that human impacts are not small by any scheme. We now, through a paper published in Nature just in December last year, showed that human created mass reached 1 teraton. It's a simple, small number. That took us 5,000 years. But in doing that, we reduced the plant biomass of the planet from 2 teratons to 1 teraton. So we now exceed the plant biomass by the human engineered mass, which is the buildings, the infrastructure, and what we've done to our landscapes. Now, the decade is founded on the 17 Sustainability Development Goals, and why the UN has picked up on this so strongly is that a restorative culture, which I again showed on Wednesday, is the glue that can link all the goals, particularly for those cultures where there is this fundamental link to the ecosystem services that they rely that are provided by nature. And these are cultures that represent around half of the global community. So they are important and they're fundamental. Now, in moving forward, the decade was fundamentally guided by the SER standards. My role was to work to get them to understand what an ecosystem is and what biodiversity is. And I'm pleased to say the UN and the best practice guidelines that are now on their way have been informed by all of these principles and an awareness that a one-size-fits-all in the restoration economy to deliver the decade is not likely to deliver the benefits and particularly the environmental sequestration of carbon that we expect. Now, the impediments and opportunities of the decades have been clearly worked through by the UN. Public awareness, political will, the correct legislative environments. A really big deal is the technical capacity, and that's been one of the major pushes that I've had on the decade. And importantly, as we've seen for this session, partnership and collaboration. And we've heard about the financing. Some of the comments that we've worked through is generally the global public is unaware that the degradation of planetary ecosystems is causing well-being and livelihood impacts for billions of humans around the world, with those costs being colossal, but we tend to hide and disguise them within our public accounting systems. But getting it right can lead to profound benefits and major investments going forward. So the key objectives of the decade are, as Teen pointed out, is about the restorative continuum. It's doing things, for example, and picking up on Tim's presentation, where do we use palm oil in our societal impacts? Should we be more vigilant now? Because I thought we all stopped using palm olive soap, but clearly there is a great use of that, all the way through to fully recovered systems. And what we're doing in the decade is linking technical capacity with a wide range of stakeholders. That's a role for our NGOs that are here today. Secondly, long-term commitment to knowledge generation. So we have the effective techniques. We don't have all the toolkit assembled to tackle all ecosystems equally and to get the biodiversity back to give us the carbon, both in the soils and above ground. We need to be catalysts for change in policy regulations and legislation. And we need to create those important financial mechanisms that we've heard some of those about, but which philanthropists in particular are now exploring. And ultimately, it is about blending public and private finance. Only then, I think, will we get the scale. But we've got to remember, best practice is not enough. So we might have the cogs to create best practice, but not necessarily the engine. So we've come up with the model within the decade, and you'll be seeing this when the document's released, merging best practice, understanding and fostering emerging practice, which then gives us leading practice. So best practice is the best available with the best available knowledge at a point in time. Leading practice means you have the answers. Three very quick studies here before I hand over to John. Spinifex in Australia covers 45% of the land area. It consists of 68 species. We still struggle to get back even 5 hectares on degraded lands other than through natural regeneration. Equally, if you look at this little image, which I've shown in one of my smoke talks, that's a little smoke plot, 65 seedlings, 23 species, 11 families. Of those 23 species, we have at least 11 that we cannot germinate on demand. So the technological challenges are looking at us. But leading practice lurks in the most unlikely places. I work with a number of nursery people on new techniques and technology for dormancy breaking. And last November, I saw this. May not mean much to many of you, but if you're New Caledonia or the East Coast, you will recognize the genus Persoonia. By using some simple understanding of what are potentially the primary natural cues of Persoonia, this nurseryman was able to germinate for the first time 10,000 Persoonia longifolia on demand for restoration programs. So we need to link, we need to go forward, and importantly, we need to probably think of better ways of what I call cooperative extinction, which is about all of us getting dirt on their boots, including the scientists. This is Seaman Knapp, 1914. He developed what was then called the Cooperative Extension Service, which was to get more useful and practical information to agriculture. And what SER found when they did an analysis of the sort of approach that Seaman Knapp did, 77% of landholders who were prepared to go forward with better farming practices supported written media, 54% preferred face-to-face interactions, 19% internet education. So maybe there's a role for SERA in developing a restoration extension service in partnership with the NGOs today. So now I'd like to hand over to John for his quick 2 slides. Thank you, John.
Well, thank you very much, TNN organisers, and to Kingsley for setting the scene so well, and also to our speakers so far, particularly Keith with his focus on networks, and Patrick with sounding the warnings around competitive behaviour between actors that stand in the way of moving in the cooperative directions that were just identified by Kingsley a moment or two ago. The decade really means and opens up the opportunity for a new way of thinking by ourselves in Australia. We really have to focus our minds on restoration at scale, way beyond the thousands, way beyond the local pilots, way beyond the local communities, and think, where are the thousands or the millions of hectares? In the Restore Australia program context, we were thinking of the order of 13, 14 million hectares, which could be restored in Australia. So that obviously depends upon accepting local solutions. And local solutions give us the local proof of concept, which has been mentioned earlier today. Linked to those local proof of concept, we often find local champions, but we need to link those local champions through to the champions in science. And it's those practitioner communities, disciplines, platforms, interdisciplinarity, science, and ultimately policy that needs to be sewn together in a seamless fashion. And that can give us the fast track, outcome-based science links right through to communities with, I would argue, a la land care, thanks to Patrick, the community ownership and the community prioritisation, as well as the community investment in restoration practices at local level. And the way to do this is really to focus on collaborative partnerships. It's those collaborative partnerships that will take us away from many years of business as usual, of competitive relationships, which led to inefficiencies in our restoration engagement more broadly within Australia. We're looking for a culture where restoring land is integral to local social fabrics. Next slide, please. And just a few points in relation to two elements to think about in relation to devising, nurturing, and managing effective partnerships for effective collaboration, which is so essential for restoration in Australia. The decade calls for massive scaling of local successes in Australia, far beyond the capacity of a few organisations. We need to identify clusters or platforms of partners with a common restoration vision and complementary capacities. As Ian referred to earlier, there's specialisations across multiple partners who exist today in Australia, but we're not taking advantage of the opportunities to link together those specialist capacities which can be devised, organised, linked together in order to develop the complementary pathways through to impact. Obviously, those partners need to be ready to co-design, co-implement and co-evaluate at both local, meso, or the missing middle, and the national stakeholder and policy level. And these effective partnerships require trust and flexibility. Those will only come about if we build steadily. We don't have time to be too slow, but we need to be steady. And we need to manage adaptively. I noticed that Keith said that it was all about the networks and particularly connecting people and connecting nature. And the question I would throw up to all of us now is, can NGOs lead the way? Perhaps instead of government, could NGOs lead the way on platforms for collaborative work that would accelerate the process of restoration on a massive scale across Australia? So thank you very much for listening. Thanks to everybody who's spoken so far, and looking forward very much to questions in the panel discussion.
Great, and you might not be able to get away that quickly, John, because we've still got a couple of minutes if people would like to address questions to John or Kingsley. John deserves the question first because he finished early, not Kingsley. No, but John, you raise a really, in fact, that's the essence of this whole session. How can we as NGOs, not-for-profits, work better together and loosen up some of our concentration on our corporate survival and perhaps look at how we might actually be able to deliver our goals better in collaboration. So has anybody got a quick question for John or Kingsley? I was only being facetious earlier about Kingsley. He's allowed to have a question. Look, you must have solved everybody's problems, you guys. So that's have we got any online questions, any virtual hands up? Now's the time to put your hand up if we have any. No? Well, that'd be wonderful because we can move straight into the panel discussion now with a minute to spare. So